going to do another tutorial for you, and this one we're going to look at the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge. In this case, I've done a panorama, total of looks like I think 8 images, taken in landscape with the camera but moving vertically. If I look at the first image there, I'm at ISO 100, 24 millimeter, f8 at 1/500th of a second. This was handheld, and one of the first things we're going to want to do, obviously we want to take these into merge them into a panoramic view, and when we do that we're going to wind up with essentially this right here, which we will then take through a series of edits both in Photoshop and back into Lightroom to get us a resulting image that looks like this. I think what I'll start with is that when you're doing panoramic shots, especially with a wide angle lens, you're going to get a fair amount of distortion. The wider the lens, the more distortion that you get. If you're going to be merging those together, you're going to want to correct as much of that distortion as you can on the front end in order to have a better chance of the images seamlessly kind of fitting together. Now, if you're far enough away from something, you can use a narrower lens. Instead of being at 24 or 14, maybe you shoot at 50 or even 70 or something like that, and it removes a lot of the distortion. But for this one right here, we're going to go pretty simple with it. One of the first tips I'll give you is that if we look at this image and we want to go to lens corrections, we'll see that I haven't done anything with it as far as chromatic aberration or profile corrections. And so I'm going to want to do both of those, but I have 8 images that I need to do that to. 2 different ways to go about it. We'll shift and click. So we've got them all selected, and you'll notice down here there's a button that says auto sync. Now this could be in the off position where you've got sync or auto sync. In the sync mode, what happens is when you make the edits to one image, you select the remainder of them that you want to make the exact same edits to, and you click sync. If you leave it on auto sync, then it will automatically make the exact same changes to all of the images that you make to this one. So typically I'll leave it on auto sync if I know that I'm going to be processing a group of photographs that I want to look the same. So we're going to click these 2, and it'll make some adjustments to each of those. And now that we've got it, if we go look at this image, we can see that it also has the same corrections that are made to it. Let's come back over here. We're going to select all of these again, and we're going to right click. It'll bring up this menu. We're going to go to Photo Merge and Panorama, and it'll take the computer a little bit. You notice up here there's spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. Each of those may have a slightly different result for you. It'll probably either be perspective or cylindrical. Once you've seen it in one direction, you can usually switch it to perspective, for example, from cylindrical. You'll get a slightly different look, and you can choose which one makes the most sense for you and feels correct. There is an auto crop button. I leave that undone. If you click auto crop, what's going to happen is when the image is created, it will take and it would have automatically cropped out all of these white areas. Those would have disappeared, and you would have been left with a much smaller image with a lot less area to work with. And that's not what we want, and I'm gonna show you why when we go into Photoshop. So that's the cylindrical view. We could look at perspective. It won't allow us to do it. We could try spherical. Spherical will usually give you maybe sometimes a little outer view. Right here it looks like there's not that much difference between these two. The next thing we can do is use the boundary warp, and what this is going to do is it's going to automatically kind of stretch things out a little bit, eliminate some of that blank area, the white area. Now you have to be a little careful when you do it because it can create some unwanted after effects, some curves, some blurred areas. So we're going to accept this and we're going to merge. It's going to take a little while. Okay, now we have our panorama merged, and you can see the name here. The first file in the list is 3564, and the pano is named after that first file, and here it's got -2 because of course I had the original one that I had done here. So now we've got an image that's been merged together. We've still got some areas that need to be cropped out. There are also some other options, And so that's what I want to kind of take a look at. Before I do that, I wanted to point out something over here. You'll see that the Enable Profile Corrections is no longer checked. And you can check this again, and you can see it took a little more of that distortion out. So even though all of these other images I had already had that treatment done to them and that change applied, on the Panorama we were able to actually apply it again, and it helped us a little bit more, took out a little bit more of the distortion, and you can see I got rid of a fair amount of the white in these areas right here. All right, so now let's take this, right click and edit in Photoshop. Okay, here we have our image in Photoshop. A couple of things I want to point out. One is you'll notice that it came over as a layer 0. And so I'll flatten the image, and that'll create then what they call the background layer. And we'll take and we'll duplicate that layer and just call it a copy, so that any changes that we make here are held within the layer rather than on the background image itself. And so I'm going to go up here and we're going to get the lasso tool, and we can do things like this. So we'll take and we'll circle this, and now we've got this area here, and if you hit Shift F5 you get a content aware fill and click OK, and it just samples the area there where you've highlighted, and then it'll fill in anything that's blank. And it's been, in my experience, extremely effective at filling in areas that are pretty generic. If you've got something that is very unique, a pattern or something along those lines, sometimes it won't match up exactly, but for the most part it does a really good job. And you'll see in a minute here we're going to try something pretty bold. Okay, we're going to see what we can do with this corner. We could just crop this out. I think in the other image actually I've done a little bit of that, but just for the purposes of this tutorial we're going to actually see what happens. Okay, we can see that did a pretty phenomenal job filling that in. We can see a little bit of a bleed, and this area right here looks very similar to that. So obviously there's some duplication, but that's very easily fixed. And that's one of the things I'm going to do now, and I won't make you watch through all of it, but take the spot healing brush tool, and if we zoom in we can see in the water there's a lot of trash and debris, and I'm going to take a little bit of time and run through and clean that up before we take this back into Lightroom. And so, I mean, just getting rid of something like that is very easy. So I'm going to run through quickly, do a little bit of cleanup on this, and then we will get back into Lightroom and finish up our edits. Okay, now we're ready to go back to Lightroom. Now that we're back in Lightroom, I want to address the buildings which are leaning in toward the center of the image. The bridge still has a little bit of a slant to it as well. And so I want to straighten those up, and we're going to use the transform tool. There is an auto button. Sometimes I've used it, but you can see here it does a really poor job. It does straighten the buildings up, but the bridge winds up way out. The line here is obviously not anywhere near where we want it to be. So I typically will use the guided upright tool. It's very helpful. What you want to do is find a straight object, vertical typically, that you can parallel, and then another one over here. Now, in many cases, I use this in architecture work, and it's really easy to find two lines that are leaning toward the center or away from the center for that matter. And in this case, really all we've got is this bridge here. And the bridge already has some built-in slant to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate that there's a certain amount there, and all I'm really trying to do is straighten it up just a little bit. Now, the buildings now look pretty straight. The bridge is maybe a little distorted. That might have been a little bit of an overkill. You can always adjust a little bit later, and the software will recalculate each time you do that and find something that you're comfortable with. I'm going to go with that for right now, so we'll tell it done. Now obviously what we've done is created these areas here that are cropped out, and so we're going to need to remove those, and we'll do that there. We're going to take this over to just about there, try to keep what we can, and we'll call that good. So now we're going to go back into Photoshop to remove this. And you may have said, well, why didn't we just do this before we went to Photoshop the first time? The problem is when you do the merge, if you recall, we had quite a few areas already that were blank. And if we tried to straighten with those in the image without having done what we did, which is fill in using that content aware fill, it would have really cropped the image down. So it was a lot less usable. There would have been a lot less information included in the image. So we're going to take this and we're going to go back into Photoshop, and we will edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. While that's importing, I thought I'd talk for a minute about this area over here. These are some control panels. Tony Kuiper, his last name's K-U-Y-P-E-R. I'll include a link to his website in the description. It has some great tools and basically made it much easier to make adjustments using Photoshop. And I realize we're doing most of our editing here in Lightroom, but there are times when I do a fair amount in Photoshop, other types of editing, and these little tools, shortcuts, if you will, are extremely helpful. So we've got the blank area here. We're at layer 0, so we're going to flatten the image so that we get to a pure background layer. And then we will take our lasso tool, which we still have. We're going to draw it around. Shift F5. OK. And now we're good to go. So, back to Lightroom. So here in Lightroom, you can see we're on our second edit out of Photoshop. It adds another edit there. And what we're going to want to do is, for me, for my style, I'd start off with some clarity, and I'm going to go all the way over. Again, I don't do that on every image, but I'll do it here. As we pointed out before, need to add the vibrance back that it loses. And this is very yellow down here. If we look at the original image that we started with, we can see that the white balance is 5850 and normal daylight temperature is 5500. So it was a little bit warm to begin with, and in our original sync process where we took all 8 images, we could have corrected that there, but we'll work with what we've got right here, and we'll bring this over maybe 10, 11, and we can see we've picked up some nice warmth there, or nice coolness. If we zoom in here and I think about that particular day and what it was like, you can see this brown area where the grass is dead and stuff. I mean, that's very much what it looked like. There is some green in there a little bit, but for the most part it was this very tan color. So I think that this white balance right now that we're looking at is pretty accurate. So we're gonna leave that there. The other thing that I want to do now, just looking at it, I might take the highlights down a little bit on that. This is pretty bright. We can always check up here, click our clipping indicator right here, and we can see the red areas. So the bridge is pretty bright. Sometimes I might just pull down on the whites a little bit and that'll help. I'm not overly concerned about it. I mean, let's face it, the bridge is white and it's in bright sunlight, so it's going to be white. There's parts of it that should be blown out in all likelihood. So we've pulled that down a little bit. That looks good. I want to go into the hue, saturation, and luminance panel. I don't want to necessarily add more saturation to this blue. It looks pretty good, but I want to add a little darkness to it. And so if I just pull the luminance down just a little bit, gives you that kind of that deep blue sky, and it just adds depth overall to that right there. We're going to wind up doing something very similar down at the bottom of the image. Speaking of which, I want to bring up a brush, and I'm going to take, and what I'm wanting to do is select the river here, because I want it to reflect more of this sky up here. And right now, of course, it doesn't look a whole lot like that. In truth, we know that it doesn't look a lot like that. It's very much a brown color, but doesn't mean we can't present it in the way we would like to see it. So I've got my feather pretty small, because I'm not wanting to get too far, or I actually don't want to get out onto the grass or the banks at all. I'm really just wanting to select the water itself. And one of the cool things here is this auto mask, and you have to watch. I think the default is not selected. I usually put it on, because most of the time when I'm masking something, not always, but the intention is to take a very specific area. Occasionally it's something that is very soft, and I want it the feather as large as I can get it. I take the flow down so that it's not hitting it with a hammer, so to speak. And I'll take the mask off, because I don't care if it bleeds a little bit. As a matter of fact, that's what I want, is this soft transition of impact that I'm making in a particular area. But here, what I'm wanting to do is simply select the water, because I'm going to make changes to it. So by keeping my feather small and keeping the auto mask on, as long as I don't get the little plus sign or the little target right in the center, as long as I keep that off of the shoreline, then Lightroom will automatically mask that edge and make sure that it doesn't bleed over onto the shoreline. So very effective tool. Oh, another thing I usually do when I'm trying to select something specific like this is go ahead and show the overlay before I do any adjustments. It wouldn't matter right now if you selected the overlay and you go make an adjustment up here, you're not really going to see it, because what you're going to see is the red. But if you're trying to select something very specific, the best way to go is just go ahead and check that box, and then make sure that what you're selecting and what you're doing, that you've got the right mask, that you've got the right areas selected that you want to make changes to. And do that first, because you can always, once you get done here, and I will do this in just a minute, one thing you'll notice too when you're masking off like this, bright white areas and very dark areas may take several passes before they get completely masked in. And sometimes that's okay, but if I'm masking an area, I want it to be masked, so I tend to make sure that I'm getting all of that. I will tell you that if you're doing portrait work, you have to pay close attention to the eyes, to fingernails, to things like that, because they will get left out of a mask. Okay, so that's pretty good. I like where that's at, so we can now turn this off. Our brush is still active, as indicated here, so we know that the changes that we make are going to be specifically to that area. And in particular, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting that water to reflect the sky. So I move that down to 15. Personal taste. Maybe it's too blue, maybe it's not blue enough. We're going to leave it there. I'm going to take the black and I'm going to punch that a little bit. It increases the mirror effect, makes it a little more dramatic, and makes this bottom area a little darker, which to me anchors the image a little bit. So pretty happy with that. I'm going to we'll go to detail, sharpening, and I'm running these way up. A little bit of an exaggeration, maybe not necessary, but So doing that, I want to mask because I certainly don't need that detail everywhere, but just maybe in the lines, the arch itself. And so that looks pretty good. I like that. And then last, I'm going to take and actually add a little bit of a vignette to just bring that focus in just a little bit more onto this arch and the buildings beyond it. So there we go. I think that's a pretty good looking image. If we go back to where we started from after the merging the images, and this is our final result. Looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.